So first we have to figure out if you can hear me in the back. Cheap seats in the back, can you hear me well? All right. Yes? No? All yeses, great, thank you. Hands high. Thank you all for coming. All of you, first of all, in the audience, and all of my friends and comrades and colleagues here who also extended the invitation. Certainly Dar al Janub, but everyone I know therein. Victoria, whose friendship has taken us a lot of different places, a lot of very productive places, and also our new contacts here like in African Studies. So I thank you for the invitation and for making this kind of interface happen, and for being complicit and facilitators of Fanonism, right? All right. There's a couple of things that I want to do here to basically elaborate upon this title that means a lot to me, the complete Fanon. So I don't want Fanon to be reduced to a symbol, as he is for many, especially in academia, which comes late to Fanon, and I will explain this. I want Fanon to be text, his own written words, his ideas, and his values. So at particular points, I will read extensively from some of his words so that you meet Fanon beyond the academic image of Fanon. Also, I want to play some audio, specifically 2 clips from grand poets of the Black Arts movement of the 1960s and 70s, and then also play a video clip. Not so much for the film as for the voice of Lauryn Hill in a new documentary on Fanon. So I'll get up and down like just a little bit, right? And when my head is down on the page and coming back at you, like I hope you think I'm still with you, okay? Great, all right. So overall, we have a lot to do here, right? We'll try to do it smoothly. Overall, Frantz Fanon authored 3 books during his lifetime, and a 4th book of his writings was published shortly after his death from leukemia, officially, at the very early age of 36. So when I teach Fanon to students, I was like, you know, he wrote his first book, he published his first book at the age of 25, right? And Fanon was gone physically from us by the time he was 36. Right? So those of us who are like near that age group, we have a lot of work to do. We got to catch up, all right? We can't be lazy and just like surfing Facebook all the time. So as the 60s came to a close, this set was reviewed as a sort of oeuvre complète by Ayikwe Armah in his brilliant essay for Negro Digest, a journal that became Black World later, called Fanon the Awakener. And I hope you know Ayikwe Armah, or you can get to know Ayikwe Armah, who is a legendary novelist himself. He's written a ton. He's gotten into publishing well, directly from the African world now. But his most famous 2 novels are The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born and 2000 Season. And Ayikwe Armah is himself a Fanonist. And after the translation of Fanon's works into English, he wrote one of the first reviews of the entire set. And it actually turned out to be one of the few written pieces that addresses Fanon works as a whole. Since then, we've had very few examples of scholars with academic credentials who can talk about all of Fanon's work instead of a piece of one, for example. There's quite a split. We could even go in further about that split, even beyond the talk. Splits in terms of disciplines and things like that. So in retrospect then, Fanon published his first book, Peau Noire, Masque Blanc, or Black Skin, White Mask in English, in 1952. I think it was written a few years prior, actually, and it was actually submitted as his doctoral thesis as he studied psychiatry in Lyon, France. And his department said, oh, no, none of this here. And he went home and wrote another thesis and went on to get his degree and to make history. But later we get this work in English, Black Skin, White Mask. He published A Dying Colonialism, which has also been translated as Sociology of a Revolution, as well as Studies in a Dying Colonialism, but it was originally published as L'Enceinte de la Révolution Algérienne in 1959. He published Direction of the Earth, initially The Damned, it was translated as in English, as Les Damnés de la Terre in 1961, during the actual week of his death in a hospital in suburban Washington, D.C., on the eve of the independence to be won by the Algerian Revolution that would transport his body for burial on liberated soil from Washington, D.C. across the Atlantic Ocean to a site along the Tunisian-Algerian border that was liberated Algerian soil. Soon thereafter, his radical publishing house published Toward the African Revolution posthumously. For the most part, it consisted of his FLN periodicals, his articles in El Mujahid, collected there in the main, and this completed what we could call a 4-volume body of work, what stood as a 4-volume body of work for decades and decades now. And I say officially Fanon's death from leukemia. He certainly suffered from leukemia, probably died from leukemia, but he died seeking hospital care in the US, right? And so this was mediated by the CIA, right? He first went to Russia for treatment. Leukemia was a death sentence at the time. And there were two places in the world known for serious treatment of leukemia. And one was Russia. He went there. There was an assassination attempt. It didn't work. And then they had to convince him to go to Washington, D.C. in the United States for treatment because he had no desire to go to the U.S. or what he called the nation of lynchers. Okay? That was facilitated by this geopolitical, military mediation, right? And I just don't think that one dies a natural death when one is in CIA custody at the same time, right? So that's why I put that in quotation marks. All four of these books that we know from Fanon has been gathered today in one giant volume of his oeuvre by El Hibber, as well as La Découverte publishers in this millennium. These are relatively new collections of all of the four books. Plus, there is a brand new collection of some of his previously unpublished texts, including more of his FLN El Mujahid articles, a few amateur plays that he wrote when he was a medical student, some of the Italian correspondence between Fanon, his publishers, and another colleague or a comrade concerning his publication in Italian, as well as a number of his often co-authored clinical psychiatry writings. They would appear in this new book for the first time that's called in English, Alienation and Freedom. First in 2005, though, in French, and then recently, 2018, in English translation. This is just a couple of weeks out in English, as it turns out. And it's a big book of collections that weighs you down. Yeah. So, but there's a great irony here in the appearance of more Fanon text today, because Fanon, for decades, has really just meant a small portion of one book, his first book, Black Skin, White Mask, as far as Western academia is concerned. They haven't done anything with the other texts, and yet here we are getting new texts. Interesting. So, and academia came to Fanon very late. The Black and other social movements of the 60s and 70s came to Fanon as soon as they could and demanded that Fanon be translated into English. And then academia would come about 35 years later, not till the late 80s and into the 90s. And since then, would they come to Fanon very late and in a weird order. The old or original publications by Fanon, long appreciated by the militants, remain neglected, if not repressed to this day by the schooled intellectuals of academic elitism. What Cedric J. Robinson called the appropriation of Frantz Fanon was a largely myopic, small-minded misappropriation of select chapters or passages from the book that Fanon wrote when he was a critical assimilé. He wasn't a revolutionary yet. This is to say, when the young Fanon still believed that he was a part of the same Franco-Western empire whose destruction is so brilliantly championed by the bulk of Fanon, by most of Fanon. The second, third, and fourth Fanon book texts that made their Pan-African revolutionary mark on the 20th century. Okay? So I want to give you the old introduction to Fanon, right? Rather than the academic and, as we'll see, post-colonialist, reintroduction of Fanon by virtue of some poetry. Sonia Sanchez of the Black Arts Movement. You can even see this on iTunes, which is how I accidentally found it, right? All right. It used to be on vinyl. So I'm introducing you here to the African revolutionary Fanon, right? This image where you see Fanon's face that is transposed onto a map of the African continent, if you notice the detail. But we'll come back to this, all right? So Sonia Sanchez gives us a poem, a spoken word piece, a verbal text that's actually called To Fanon here. I'm going to try to cue it and hope the technology cooperates.
At one point, a lot of us who started dealing with blackness came across a man named Frantz Fanon, who said something that culture meant only one thing, an environment shaped to help us and our children grow, shaped by ourselves in action against the system that enslaves us, because we are enslaved, And the cracker is not to be played with. He is the enslaver, master, we the slaves. The evil he does is not new, cannot be resolved through rhetoric, hate, poems, loving more than one woman. The cracker is deep, deeper than the 400 years of our slavery. We must watch our slavery, especially when it looks like freedom, because slaves can look beautiful, talk beautifully, can be deceived by the devil who lights our small flames of rage, then extinguishes them when they threaten to spread. The master is masterful, is the supreme animal of destruction, and cannot be destroyed with only long dresses, Swahili, curses, soul food, fervor, dashikis, naturals, poems, soul, rage, leather jackets, slogans, polygamy, Yoruba. No, black people, no, we need war, discipline, learning, land, planning, love, and power, power, blacker than the smell of death. We the hunters need to destroy the beast who enslaves us.
Okay, so what interests me about Sonia Sanchez here is that she can invoke Fanon and invoke the complete Fanon, all of Fanon. It doesn't have to be chapter and verse. Like, well, in this particular book, this particular idea, or that particular chapter, because they know all of Fanon and will be applying him to the comprehensive environment of the political struggle. And she will recognize that elements of our struggle will be commodified, right, in order to de-radicalize our struggle and turn it into commercial entertainment, right, in various different ways. And so we could spend a long time with her Fanonist words. The rhetoric of post-coloniality, by contrast, could only find a very paradoxical application over Fanon's four established book texts, even though post-colonial studies would establish or institutionalize itself over the last several decades now as a purely academic affair, in no small part with its version of Fanon as quite the monumental figure in the criticism. For them, black skin, white mask is Fanon, right? Both metaphorically and literally, Fanon stands for black skin, white mask, and vice versa, even if they don't read the entire book, even if they don't discuss that entire book. The wretched of the earth may be known, but if so, it is feared and altogether disavowed in the main. Historically, a dying colonialism has absolutely iconic status in many discourses outside of academia, thanks to its legendary accounts of the veil in the Algerian Revolution, and or the radio in the Algerian Revolution, and or the French-European use of doctors and medical science for torture against the Algerian Revolution. As we continue to see in Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, and other U.S. imperialist prison torture centers, along with every Israeli Zionist site of captivity in the present day, that analysis continues to assert itself. But despite its central significance also for Gillo Pontecorvo's film, his classic film work in the Battle of Algiers, as Victoria mentioned, a dying colonialism never stands for Fanon in post-colonial studies, although a kind of hearsay about colonized women smuggling bombs to detonate against colonizers may sometimes radiate some latent colonial anxiety in these neo-colonial academic circles as well. But it's not a book, and it doesn't stand for Fanon. Toward the African Revolution must be the least known and least read of all of Fanon's four established book texts. This may help explain the inability of academics of the West to follow Fanon in the easy task of classifying Algeria as African and the Algerian Revolution in Pan-African terms as a part of Fanon's amplified African Revolution. It can also further explain why academic critics who do read more than one Fanon book could read The Wretched of the Earth as if it were only about Algeria and Algeria alone, which is actually critically absurd. It is no less absurd when some writers, and even self-declared Fanon enthusiasts like Frank B. Wilderson III, sometimes refer to Fanon's two books, and you wonder what math class some of these people took, a miscalculating reflection of the canonical status of black skin, white mask on the one hand, and on the other hand, their neo-colonial fear or counter-revolutionary political anxiety surrounding the wretched of the earth. In short, for mainstream academic humanities in general and post-colonial studies in particular, black skin, white mask is a fetishized object. A fetishized object, while the wretched of the earth is a phobic object. When it is known or rarely read, since it cannot be seriously read, then as a matter of fact, not by these folk. It should also be said that black skin, white mask is a dismembered object in post-coloniality, since it is partially and selectively read over and again as it is amputated from Fanon's more complete body of work, the whole corpus of his praxis that is quite the antithesis of the rhetoric and discursive postures of post-colonial studies in the Western academic machine. So I just want to give you a glimpse of some of the many book covers in different languages so you know which text that we're talking about here. start this over. All right. So this is chronologically, this is the first book that he writes, planning to submit it as his medical thesis. And they're like, get out of here, are you kidding us? And you can see like a German translation, as well as an English translation here. And notice, because this happens across the United States, it's very significant. This book says Frantz Fanon, Black Skin, White Mask, but notice it's advertised as author of The Wretched of the Earth. So even when we get Black Skin, White Mask, we're getting it because of The Wretched of the Earth or the complete Fanon, the rest of Fanon, and it's not read in isolation, okay? We're gonna see this over and over again, not only on book covers, but also on adverts and what have you. We see it in the discourse at large, right? Then we have A Dying Colonialism. Of course, this is L'Encinq, right? De la Révolution Algérienne. It has multiple English subtitle translations. This is probably the second to the last publication in English. And then one of the many copies of The Wretched of the Earth in English as well as in German. Probably the most popular version in the history of the US. Now this is like an old used copy. Lots of industry politics are going on now. That's The Wretched of the Earth, but a couple of more. One of the earliest editions of Fanon in English in North America, at least, in a historic Arabic edition that many of my interviewees in Palestine read, and which I also saw in the public library in Nablus, for example, like in the West Bank. And it had been so read by so many different prisoners, it was almost illegible to me, you know, almost. And even though I'd held a copy in my hand somewhere else. But notice here, it's The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon, a Negro psychoanalyst, study of the problems of racism and colonialism in the world today. And so again, the presentation connects it to the Black Skin, White Mask that you would read only in light of the rest of this particular text. And Fanon is actually, he can sometimes use the discourse of psychoanalysis like he can sometimes use the discourse of philosophy, but he is not a psychoanalyst himself. Right? He can read those texts and often read them against the grain, normally read them against the grain, and apply them in ways that their original theoreticians would never dream of applying them. All right? So the book that is published after his death in '64 is Toward the African Revolution. This is like wrong, it should be African Algerian. And this is a Mexican edition, as well as the second to the last English edition here. So now you've seen like a little bit of what these books look like, and you're more experienced with the whole corpus now than most of post-colonial studies. Okay. All right. The politics of prefixes play an extraordinary role here that should not be overlooked, right? Is that an easy word to hear like in English? I'm not quite sure. Prefixes, right? As in post-coloniality. The constant trending of prefix discourses is certainly a basic feature of academic industry. It is part of its rigidly classifying and periodizing impulse, anchored in the history of Western European epistemology and its metaphysics of knowledge production, without a doubt, right? You know, whenever you study anything, there's an authority standing somewhere that says when, where, what decade, what year, like what place, use the nation state, like et cetera, right? So this is really like a part of that particular, very specific Western European way of approaching knowledge and knowledge production. Now, in the age of neo-colonial neoliberalism and consumerism, with its late capitalist expansion of the space of the academic marketplace, which is embedded in the military-industrial complex, this habit of prefixing is all the more common. It is really thought to be chic and sexy and fashionable, right, in the mind of certain discursive postures and paradigms to post this and post that. You're supposed to sound really smart, like, and really cute when you say, like, post this, you know, like, I'm going in to post this, I'm involved in like post that, things that have no chronological relationship to anything, put the term post in front of it and you assume a certain posture, right? Pan-Africanist scholarship has long problematized the use of the category of the pre-colonial by white Africanist area studies in various accounts of continental African history and civilization, for making eons of African life before European conquest a mere footnote to its history of white colonization. Yet, the near automatic prefix that circulates ad nauseum around Fanon and post-colonial studies is, of course, not the pre or the anti, but this phenomena of the post. It's virtually obligatory. There is a compunction to post everything in all discourses in an age when everything is supposed to be discourse without practice. If one speaks of colonialism, it's especially obligatory to post it in particular, right? It's easier. You get a better reception. Is that me? You get a better reception. It's a little bit safer if you mention colonialism and say post-colonialism. That way nobody thinks you have a knife, right? Okay. It therefore needs to be said that Fanon never writes or utters any cognate of the word post-colonial. Never. Yet he is systematically cast as a post-colonial theorist by post-colonial studies. Fanon knew colonialism proper as a thinker of colonialism who acted against it in ways which academics would only avoid, if not condemn today. This much is abundantly clear. But political opposition and anti-colonialism disappear from Fanon in studies of colonialism when they are discoursed by post-colonial studies. The prefixes of neo-colonialism as well as anti-colonialism do not, as a rule, factor into the post-colonialist commodification of the study of colonialism. This study of colonialism is apparently for academic study alone and for academic advancement alone. The linguistic fixation of and on the post when it comes to colonialism is no doubt also reflective of a Western ideology of progress, or progress under Occidentalism, or rather the rise of the West to global, colonial, racial, capitalist domination, or what it normally can just call modernity. Moreover, it's easy to remark a rhetorical duplicity in the casual articulation of the post by post-colonial studies. When pressed by more radical critics of colonialism, it may reply that the post and post-coloniality is not merely a chronological marker. But this response is customarily a reaction, belated and underdeveloped. Even so, 1493 or the late 19th century would theoretically be as post-colonial then as 2013 or 2018, to follow such a distorted logic. The content of post-colonial studies still typically reveals that the post does indeed, casually, uncritically presume that colonialism is a simple era or event that is past, that independence and decolonization happened somewhere in actuality, that coloniality without any post is not a present tense matter or a future concern, and that today is thus the time to talk about globalization or transnationalism or perhaps neoliberalism, but not a colonizing imperialism continued. By contrast, someone like Aníbal Quijano from Peru would therefore theorize his concept of the coloniality of power, again, without prefixes. For example, and the Coloniality Working Group, consisting primarily of students at the State University of New York at Binghamton, came to expand upon this work considerably before it would get effaced by the later rhetorical fad of the decolonial, now as a new academic market tag circulated in response to the problem that was and that still is post-coloniality or post-colonial studies. All that said, colonialism has never been one-dimensional or monoform. There's this basic idea in post-colonial studies that you can talk about the post-colonial because the old colonial was very simplistic and only took one form. But of course, you always had direct rule and indirect rule, right? Colonialism was never actually strictly national, although we assume that. A given colony in Africa or anywhere else might be politically administered under one national flag of Europe, but controlled economically by another European country. And so our image of colonialism in the past is quite stereotypical, that reduces it to certain formula and then makes some people think that they're beyond colonialism and in post-colonialism now, when it's simply like continues to carry on some of the same strategies that they have never recognized. If you look at the work of Walter Rodney, for example, his work on the Hispano-Portuguese slave trade in the 15th century showed us very clearly that what we could have called proto-colonialism 500 years ago looks very much like what we call neo-colonialism now, right, before the consolidation of the nation states that were more clearly useful to imperial capitalism in that middle period. So post-colonial studies never notices the fact that the earliest Fanon, the first Fanon, never uses the word decolonization. Fanon can't use the word decolonization in Black Skin, White Mask because he hasn't broken from the French Empire yet. He's criticizing racism that comes from colonialism, right? But he's still writing as an ambivalent, if oftentimes brilliant and radical assimilé, who still thinks he belongs like to the French Empire, right? But it's interesting that after all of this talk about black skin, white mask, they have yet to notice that he does not speak of decolonization, let alone liberation. He's speaking against racism, but racism on a narrow definition, racism on the physical, biological, physiognomic understanding of racist discrimination according to color of one's skin. But he still thinks he can belong to the French Empire. Right? After the publication of Black Skin, White Mask, he participates in Dar al Janub and Présence Africaines, first International Congress of Black Writers and Artists. And his speech for that conference was called Racism and Culture. And Fanon has a kind of epiphany here. He realizes that there is biological racism of colonial imperialism, but then there's also the cultural or civilizational racism of cultural imperialism. And you can't speak out against physical racial discrimination and still think you belong to the culture of the empire, right? And so he thinks himself like out of that on his way to the Algerian African Revolution. All right, so post-colonial studies doesn't notice this difference like in Fanon, even when it and White Mask. The Fanon of Toward the African Revolution, among so many other texts, could and does speak amply and loudly for decolonization, against what it calls pseudo-independence or puppet independence, toward what it calls true and total independence, bona fide independence, as Fanon prophesied neo-colonial imperialism in startling detail in the name of African revolution, in the name of third worldism, and in the name of a new humanity. And this revolutionary would never be the Fanon of post-colonial studies. Yet, earlier, the Fanon taken up like a general weapon by the Black liberation movement of the 1960s and the 1970s was revived in North America after the revolution of his dreams. And I will say revived not only because of Western capitalist colonialism and neo-colonialism, but also because of like orthodox Marxism of the West and also the Westernized, right, who were scandalized by Fanon's freedom of thought, right, with respect to the Cold War and with respect to Eurocentric class categories, even though he was very amenable and really like respectful to the logic of Marxist opposition, it wasn't orthodox enough for Western and Westernized Marxists, and so there was great resentment of Fanon on their behalf as well. But then we get to the Black Power movement, and something else is going to happen. So it's actually quite cliche now to say that the Direction of the Earth was the Bible of the Black Power movement. To recall that Eldridge Cleaver, one-time Panther, to recall his quote that, quote, every brother on every rooftop can quote that Fanon. To note the presence of both Studies in a Dying Colonialism and Direction of the Earth at the top of the reading list of the Black Panther Party political education program. Mumia Abu-Jamal, even today, in recent days, he continues to record audio programs from prison about Fanon, with whom he identifies as a fellow Black revolutionary journalist based upon Fanon's El Mujahid work that is collected in Toward the African Revolution. Here, he recalls how crucial the study of the Direction of the Earth was for the founding of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California, and how Huey P. Newton read the book over 6 times in the process of the founding of the party, according to Bobby Seale, the co-founder. Stokely Carmichael, who of course will become Kwame Ture, and who is known for giving us the term Black Power, he would recall Frantz Fanon as his personal quote-unquote patron saint in his Black Power address in 1967 at the Dialectics of Liberation Conference in London. Our Prentice Bunchy Carter, who's another amazing figure I urge you to explore, he was in prison with Eldridge Cleaver and then soon became the leader of the Southern California chapter of the Black Panther Party in Los Angeles. But before he joined the Panthers, he would actually start his own organization, a smaller organization, which he named the Wretched of the Earth, right? You know, so just like we have Dar al Janub here, right? And the Panthers and what have you, someone could ask you, oh yeah, so what political organization do you belong to? And at one point, Bunchy Carter and his friends would be like, yeah, the Wretched of the Earth, that's us, okay? And you know, like if we ever want our work to be relevant, then maybe can dream that one day we will write a book, right, whose title will become the title of a political organization of significance. The biggest poets of the Black arts movement were no different in this Fanonist regard, namely from Leroy Jones to Jane Cortez, who we're going to listen to, and Sonia Sanchez, and back to Leroy Jones when he became Amiri Baraka. Another giant of praxis and the official field marshal of the Black Panther Party was George Jackson, who until his assassination in prison identified himself as a Marxist, Leninist, Maoist Fanonist. right? And many of his comrades in prison as Maoist Fanonists. You know, when you could take the Marxist-Leninism for granted, you could just say Maoist Fanonist. Decades later, in the footsteps of his incarcerated studies, Yaki Sales, a man named Yaki Sales, I urge you to look up, he would even publish a projected four-volume pamphlet study guide, now posthumously collected as a book, as a big book of the 4 volumes, entitled Meditations on Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. So this is a prisoner who wrote a book that is a study guide of the Wretched of the Earth, paragraph by paragraph by paragraph. There, he constantly warns readers against the exploitation and misappropriation of Fanon by wily academic intellectuals, and a new anti-militant translation of the book, of the text in English. So it should be noted that without this praxis work of Black and other social movements from the 60s and the 70s, that post-colonial studies would not have a Fanon to play with. Right? This initial demand for Fanon then in English in North America was made possible by revolutionary insurgency. And it was facilitated by Al Janub and Présence Africaine. Al Janub met with Fanon, I believe, in Ghana at the conference organized under Nkrumah there, the Congress of African Peoples, and arranged for an English translation of this manuscript that Fanon was working on, right? So this work was facilitated in different languages because of political insurgency and for political insurgency. Nobody did it for post-colonial studies, right? And yet it's interesting that Peau Noire Masque Blanc was tellingly the last of Fanon's books to be translated into English. And in fact, there are many countries in the world where it's still not translated, but the other works are, right? That happened in English in 1967, whereas the translation of The Wretched of the Earth into English debuted as The Damned, and on the African continent mostly, actually, in 1963, okay? So I can show you real quick the table of contents for these 2 works, right? So here is a table of contents for L'Enceinte, which opens with this very legendary chapter called Algeria Unveiled, which is better, richer, more militant, like in French. It's L'Algérie se dévoile, Algeria unveils herself. This is the voice of Algeria. If you follow through Fanon's discourses on the radio, which I know DJs should in particular. The Algerian Family, chapter 3, which is connected to chapter 1 organically. A last chapter on Algeria's European minority, but also this 4th chapter on medicine and colonialism, which is still writing about the Black site prisons of the US, right? And certainly Zionist torture of Palestinians, right? In various locations in and beyond historic Palestine. And then Les Données de la Terre is not there. Sorry, wrong version saved here, right? But we have very important chapters in this particular text as well. It opens with the chapter that is called, in translation, Concerning Violence, and then which talks about the violence of colonialism, how it is coincident with the atmosphere under colonialism, and how it would be met by counter-violence, right? Slipshod commentary in academia and also in the media likes to talk about Fanon as quote-unquote an apostle of violence, right? But Fanon is a critic of colonial violence who talks about the counter-violence of the oppressed, which wages armed struggle in order to liberate itself from violence. In point of fact, the 2nd chapter in The Wretched of the Earth is on spontaneity. Spontaneity is strengths and weaknesses, and so it talks about spontaneous uprisings, right? And actually what spontaneous uprisings bring to political struggle that is important. At the same time that chapter focuses on how we need to organize counter-violence as well. But he doesn't actually do the traditional thing, which is to totally devalue spontaneous, uprising. Right, which is interesting. And then we have this interesting that in The Wretched of the Earth, I think each of the chapters could be legendary in different times on different points, right? And so we have the critique of the national bourgeoisie, the critique of the native bourgeoisie, the comprador elite, right? The neo-colonial elites of the Third World, and a chapter that has been translated as The Pitfalls of National Consciousness. And then we get the chapter on a national culture that doesn't think about culture in relationship to the colonized in terms of belly dancing and navel gazing in the academy. You're saying, oh, look at your culture, it's beautiful, isn't mine, But instead, culture is a part of the revolutionary fight. which is very different from Fanon's earliest engagements with culture when he's thinking about negritude. And he's actually threatened by negritude as an assimilé at first. As a revolutionary, negritude doesn't do enough. It doesn't go far enough. And we get these incredible insights in the Unnational Culture chapter. And the final chapter in Direction of the Earth before the conclusion, which also is quite a legendary short text, we get the chapter that's called Colonial War and Mental Disorders, where he continues to ply his trade as a revolutionary psychiatrist and look at the way that we are scarred by the violence of colonialism, even as we wage war against it, and how we will live with those scars for a long time, and how we will have to bandage up these scars, right? And continue to do the work that we need to do, not only to liberate ourselves from colonialism, but also to restore the humanity of the world. And so that's the wretched of the earth. In English, the damned or condemned of the earth. In English, or les damnés de la terre. All right. So a recent black critic of post-coloniality, supposedly, Frank B. Wilderson, tries to dichotomize Fanon in his book Red, White, and Black, Cinema and the Structure of U.S. Antagonism, so that he presents black skin as white mask as if it's a text about race and slavery over here, and thereby blackness. And he presents The Wretched of the Earth as, by contrast, a text that is about post-coloniality, right? Land restoration or settler colonialism, as if these things can actually be separated. As if colonialism was not a part of slavery, all across the Americas, especially. And as if slavery wasn't actually colonial slavery, right, in plantation America or the Western Hemisphere. This is a false dichotomy. Fanon's corpus does not yield this schism. It should go without saying that Black Skin, White Mask is itself a text of colonialism, right? Of French colonialism. It is often and falsely read as only a Caribbean text that is supposedly inapplicable to Afro-North America or even non-French colonies in the Caribbean or the Antilles. Despite its central references to Chester Himes and Richard Wright and black folklore of Afro-North America, and even though this Fanon in Black Skin, White Mask had written, quote, "I come back to one fact, wherever he goes, the Negro remains a Negro." The Wretched of the Earth is often and falsely read as an exclusively Algerian text, exclusively and only, as if it were inapplicable to North America, despite its numerous references to niggers, as well as to negritude or Negro African culture, blackness, especially for the Second International Congress of Black Writers and Artists in Rome, right? Despite its global third world politics that is inclusive of the entire third world, and despite Fanon's aggressively militant Pan-Africanism, right? So these are some of the ways that academic offerings have continued to try to divide Fanon and to divide us in our relationship to Fanon and through Fanon. Curiously, Wilderson's memoir, a different book called Incognegro, would expose what I call the counterinsurgent canonization of Black Skin, White Mask, or certain parts of it, in certain quarters, thanks to Wilderson's youthful contact with the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party did not dichotomize blackness and colonialism, right? Or anti-blackness and anti-colonialism. In fact, he writes in his memoir, quote, "My father had caught me with it last night," talking about the Wretched of the Earth that the Black Panther Party gave him, right? "And he beat the living daylights out of me, so I knew it must be good." That had never happened with Invisible Man, the novel by Ralph Ellison. Then, using one of my old cocktail party gimmicks, I quoted a passage from Fanon from memory. Quote, "From birth, I began, it is clear to him that this narrow world, strewn with prohibition, can only be called into question by absolute violence." That's a quote from Concerning Violence in the Wretched of the Earth. I told Darnell, who's in the Black Panther Party office in this scene, that for some strange reason, that had made me think about Kenwood. He grew up in Kenwood, Minnesota, an almost all-white, very racist environment, right? But why, I didn't know. Nor did I know why my father had beaten me when Fanon's other book, Black Skin, White Mask, was nestled on his bookshelf beside the works of Sigmund Freud, right? So I think this is very interesting. Whenever I teach Fanon, I ask students in the audience to reflect upon this, right? One book is cocktail party fare, right? The other book gets you a beating. The other book gets you a beating. This is like a gauge of the danger that they represent. Hence, Wilderson seeks to quarantine the Wretched of the Earth himself from Kenwood, Minnesota, and all settler sites of the U.S. Colonialism, conceding it away from blackness in an ongoing quarrel he has with post-coloniality, with Native American studies, and sometimes Palestinian discourses of analogy. Wilderson's perspective is a very petty bourgeois and chauvinistic one. Even though Wilderson needs to exploit, right, the rhetorical expressions of the wretched of the earth to make his own discourse sound more radical. But when he exploits the wretched of the earth to make his own discourse sound more radical, he doesn't tell you he's using the wretched of the earth. He just says Fanon, right? Because he still wants to give you the impression that that book doesn't apply here, right? And he wants to give us Black Skin, White Mask as if it too doesn't emerge from colonialism as commentary on colonialism. So Wilderson is this new Afro-pessimist in blackface that leaves all colonialism to post-colonial studies. Even though he pretends to be a critic of it, he still gives them Fanon. And he only takes the Fanon text that he needs for a very colonized pessimist critique. Yet there is also a serious problem of elliptical truncation in Wilderson's repeated quotation of the end of the world line taken from Black Skin, White Mask, right? A lot of academics are coming to cite this line without context, right, lately, right? When Fanon talks about the end of the world. It's sort of like when Eric Garner was choked to death by the NYPD, like in New York, you can see on the internet there was a quote from Fanon about us not being able to breathe. Now, no one could tell you what book this came from. Like they hadn't read it, it's an avatar now and it circulates, right? And then, there's another supposed quotation from Fanon about cognitive dissonance that circulates like as an avatar, but it's like a basic dictionary definition of cognitive dissonance. I'm not even sure it's Fanon, right? And normally people don't even ask the question. The younger Fanon wrote, quote, "The Martinican is a man crucified. My friend had fulfilled in a dream his wish to become white. That is, to be a man. I will tell him, the environment, society are responsible for your delusion. Once that has been said, the rest will follow of itself. And what that is, we know, the end of the world." So this is the actual quote. The world in question is still a quite specific one. It is not the only world that is or ever was, before another must be created into being out of necessity. It is the white world that represents itself as if it were the only world in truth, right? When you hear this line in pessimism, there's only one world, and it's the white world, right? But that's actually not Fanon. The Fanon of Black Skin, White Mask was writing about a certain type or class of Negro who comes to crave this world, this white world. The introduction is very plain about this from the start. He writes, "I shall try to discover the various attitudes that the Negro adopts in contact with the white civilization." He tells you this in the opening, okay? I'm only writing about this class, the assimilé, right? "The jungle savage is not what I have in mind," this Fanon says with the arrogance of the colonized elite. The assimilé that was also called the évalué. Can you imagine using like this language, the evolved class, because the rest of us are unevolved, right? That is because for him, certain factors have not yet acquired importance. This is still a very, elitist discourse. He is dealing with the climbers in social class terms. If notably, to speak a language is to take on a world. The accursed world of the Antilles is left behind by the non-jungle savage who strives, who climbs, in order to become truly a part of the French world of France in his captured imagination. But of course, he finds nullification in that world of his cultivated longings. After all, Fanon wrote famously, a normal Negro child, having grown up within a normal family, will become abnormal on the slightest contact with the white world, right? This is a highly quotable Fanon there. What's more, he continues, in the white world, Fanon writes, the man of color encounters difficulty in the development of his bodily schema, right? That the body is experienced as a curse in the white world. And even a body that doesn't quite come together, right, as an experience as a whole body. He would experience his body as a corporeal malediction, as a curse in and of itself, insofar as he identifies this really white world as the only real world that could really possibly matter to him, like Wilderson and his new school of pessimists in blackface. Crucially, one Fanon becomes another Fanon to be suppressed here. The iconic anti-colonialist black revolutionary psychiatrist with a hospital now named for him in Blida, Algeria, a militant ambassadorship to Ghana behind him, a neuropsychiatric daycare center in Tunisia co-founded by him, and a national archive now named for him in Algiers, among many other things and many other places. All told, Fanon made substantial references to the black world, the African world, as well as the Arab world, over and against the white world, the settlers' world, the colonial world cut in two, the Western world, and much more. We cannot forget this. The white world masquerading as the world proper is clearly exposed to be a certain world outside, the world of the foreigner. The worlds of third worldism are meant to upstage it at long last. The actively underdeveloped world will shake the world whose opulence is steeped in slavery and its blood, destroying the colonizing zoning of Europeanism, not by rational confrontation or conversation as it was before, but through armed struggle and resistance, what he calls counterviolence. The move charted by the ultimate Fanon, which is most Fanon, is no longer that of the climber from the jungle to the mother culture, to the mother country, allegedly, or to its manhood, but it's the colonized individual who moves on to the liberated nation, who moves on to the unwhitened world at large for internationalism, and that world must be expressly expropriated from European appropriation. He writes, "It is a question of the third world starting a new history of man, a new human being. The direction of the earth cannot be quarantined from Fanon's discourse on human being, or humanism, as Wilderson and many others would have it, for it is the climax of that discourse on colonial imperialism, as well as slavery. For such colonialism and slavery form an inseparable complex of physical and metaphysical or psycho-affective assaults on the humanity of the rest of us by the white West." If I were to give you a synopsis or a summary of the direction of the earth, what I would do is play for you Jane Cortez, which is what I'll do now. Right? So here, any jazz fans here? Any Ornette Coleman folk? Anybody know Ornette Coleman? Jane Cortez was married to Ornette Coleman. They had a son together who's actually the drummer in her band when she formed a band from her poetry of the Black Arts Movement. Please come in. So there's like the mama poet and her son. They were known as Jane Cortez and the Fire Spitters. I invite you to like pursue this, like a lot more. But this is how certain things are coming together. Fanon was actually a jazz critic. Wrote extensively about this sort of thing. Okay. All right. Let's see here.
Violence, violence, violence.
So this is a poem, if that word can capture what you're about to hear, by Jane Cortez. It's called Dialogue on Violence. Okay? And this I offer as a synopsis of the opening chapter, at least, of the Direction of the Earth, right? And which also testifies to the Fanonism of the Black Arts Movement.
That human violence, that structural violence, that behavioral violence, this sexual violence, this official and unofficial violence, this police violence, this clergy violence, this family violence, this economic violence, this global violence, this military violence, this psychological violence, this personal violence, this gang violence, and rape, the pure form of violence. The birth of violence is the violence of birth. The violence within us is deep, so deep. Don't tell anybody, don't tell anybody. It's that direct, indirect, productive, reproductive, amateur, anonymous, insidious, political, pent-up, legitimate, invisible, judicial, collective, imperialist, atomic, drunk, static, viral, capitalist, atomic cult kind of violence. That violence will sink your soul, will sink your soul. Violence is violence in forced prostitution, violence in sexual services, and violence in hypocrisy, and violence in bourgeois democracy, and violence in technology, violence in vocabulary, and violence and privilege, and violence and power. Depression, repression, suppression, oppression, depression, repression, suppression, oppression is the victim and the victimizer. The sacrifice and the one who sacrifices. Don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody. Interrogation, interrogation. Intolerance, intolerance. Deprivation, deprivation. Complicity, complicity. Torture, torture. Domination, domination, domination. Pain, leave no traces. Avoid the pain, leave no traces. Pain, breed fear, blood, pain. and violence and monopoly, and violence and poverty, and violence and hunger, and violence and resentment, and that poverty reactionary violence, corporate violence, industrial violence, urban violence, rural violence, ethnic violence, pharmaceutical violence, the violence of AIDS, drugs, and terrorism. Put a muzzle on violence. That rough violence, that brittle violence, that blinded violence, that twisted violence, that wet violence, that cold violence, that hidden violence, that funny violence, that blunt violence, that obsolete violence, that absolute violence, that provocative violence, that preventive violence, that right violence, that irrelevant violence, that protective violence, that safe violence, that nasty violence, that clean violence, that bleak violence, that empty violence, that competitive violence, that modern violence, that traditional violence, that violence for the sake of violence, that necessary and unnecessary violence. Let the violence be known and give it up if you don't really want it. Give it up if you don't really want it.
So there's Jane Cortez ending with a machete behind her back, right? So that unnecessary and necessary violence, right? Give it up if you don't really want it. There she is theorizing the counter-violence. If you don't want us to be violent, then stop bringing this violence into our lives, right? Stop bringing the unnecessary violence, right, that necessitates, right, the counter-violence of liberation. It is like authentically and scrupulously Fanonian, okay? But then there is this notion of negrophobia that I want us to come back to, right? Because it is not like that there aren't radical strains of black skin, white mask, which are strains that post-colonial studies hasn't dealt with, as a matter of fact, right? There's some very important material there that we can analyze in light of the revolutionary Fanon, in light of the African revolutionary Fanon. And negrophobia in black skin, white mask, it's the other side of the Oedipus complex, right? We especially need to talk about this because of like Austria and Freud, right, and psychoanalysis and what have you. This is very necessary. For when black families in black skin, white mask are, in black societies are cleared of neurosis or sexual neurosis in this text, the white family, classically enshrined by Sigmund Freud as well as Jacques Lacan, are exposed to Fanon's fresh anti-racist analysis. The primitivist idea that every intellectual gain requires a loss in sexual potential is exploded. The civilized and civilizing white family of the West is identified as not only a scene of complexes, but on a much greater macro-social level as a miniature of the colonialist nation, as the agent of an imperialist system, this family, and a workshop for the production of white supremacist identities. Freud and Lacan didn't tell us this. The black body serves as a central phobogenic object, Fanon writes, for this white family unit. A phobia, traditionally speaking, is a neurotic fear of an object or a situation. The terror of racist phobias is read customarily as sexual revulsion by Fanon. And proceeding with complete orthodoxy, he writes, Fanon unmasks this revulsion as a disavowed desire for immoral and shameful things. As a result, the sociogenic condition of the white family man and woman with adiposexual neurosis is diagnosed here by the early Fanon as the psychopathology of negrophobia. Black persons symbolize for whites, quote, the sexual instinct in its raw state, the incarnation of a genital potency beyond all moralities and prohibitions. He writes, to suffer from a phobia of Negroes is to be afraid of the biological, for the Negro is the biological. The Negroes are animals. They go about naked, and God only knows, close quote. The underside of this binary division between the intellectual and the biological is laid out at last. The white family unit of the culture of Occidentalism is riddled with so-called neurosis for Fanon, but this is the psycho-political repression of the white racist culture that generates what we can call negrophobic genders and negrophobic sexualities as a white imperialist rule. The sexual self-descriptions of colonial culture are thus voided as a consequence of Fanon's strategically orthodox interpretation of psychoanalytic individualism. Their identity categories, such as homosexual and heterosexual, serve as masks in black skin, white mask. Now, neither white manhood nor white womanhood can be classified in terms of heterosexuality, true heterosexuality per se, or homosexuality. There is a racist perversion of bestiality at their core. Fanon writes, that is because the negrophobic woman is in fact nothing but a putative sexual partner, just as the negrophobic man is a repressed homosexual. The erotic identities of the allegedly heterosexual white man and the allegedly heterosexual white woman are both demonstrated to be anchored in black male bodies, which, because they are scripted as subhuman bodies, cannot possibly participate in the human sexualities of heterosexuality or even repressed homosexuality. To be heterosexual or homosexual, one must be human sexual. Therefore, we don't refer to dogs and cats as hetero or homo, right? We have to pay attention to this. Fanon's continued use of the conventional language might suggest this is possible, but it is not. The genders and sexualities of the white West can in no way conform to their own social ideals or descriptions, not with negrophobia front and center in any anti-racist critique. All of the gender and sexuality positions taken for granted by gender and sexuality paradigms today without Fanon are the gender and sexuality positions of negrophobia, which is to say white racist, anti-black, and white supremacist gender and sexuality politics in academia, political activism, etc. The critical perspective in Black Skin, White Mask on homosexuality and white men is perceptive instead of strictly phobic itself. Not confined to a stigmatized minority, it addresses white men in general. It logically accompanies the kin criticisms of sexuality in white women as various binary dichotomies proceed to break down. All colonial sexuality is organized around colonial racism, Fanon famously and characteristically writes, particularly the black penis hysteria of white European empire. The only problem with these passages in Black Skin, White Mask is that the orthodoxies of psychoanalysis are not flipped even further to symbolically complement an analysis of phobia surrounding black males with a similar analysis of phobia surrounding black female bodies. Negrophobia is not confined by gender, masculinity, or femininity, manhood or womanhood. The history of Sarah Bartman or the Hottentot Venus at France's Museum of Man is instructive here, like all these great museums in Austria, right? The concept of negrophobia demands completion in Fanon, so it should be added that the negrophobic man is nothing but a putative sexual partner, just as a negrophobic woman is a repressed homosexual with regard to black females, who are no less construed as hypersexual by white racist imperialism, like the black male who is coded as a walking phallus, right? But the terms must differ then. A white man cannot literally be a repressed homosexual vis-a-vis black male bodies or a heterosexual aggressor vis-a-vis black male bodies. These notions of hetero and homosexuality are racial myths internal to the white culture of white gender and sex alike. Let us say that they are diversions or distractions, as a matter of fact. Black people are barred from this category of human being and its species categories of modern human sexuality as well as gender proper, which means human gender, of course. So nor can a white woman literally be a heterosexual aggressor vis-a-vis black male bodies, terminologically speaking, or a repressed homosexual vis-a-vis black female bodies. To be hetero or homo requires that one first access the human. The Homo sapien humanity denied the colonized and guarded as a strict racial property by the white colonizer. The repressive, racially exclusive formation of heterosexuality and homosexuality alike is reserved for white bodies alone, as the human sexuality of the West and its colonial racist humanism. In the way that this mythic white heterosexuality and white homosexuality function together as white mask for negrophobic reactions to black skin should not be ignored by revolutionary readings of each of the most radical moments in the earliest Fanon, as in the striking Psychopathology and the Negro chapter of Black Skin, White Mask. This all follows from what this Fanon had identified as a first principle of white colonial empire civilization, whose carnal violence is neither heterosexual or homosexual proper. To be precise, it is Eurosexual, even something like Blancosexual. The critique of negrophobia turns into an outright and militant revolutionary critique of Arabophobia, and arguably Islamophobia too, and Algeria Unveiled, right? And when you read all of Fanon and the different texts in relationship to each other, you can start to see these continuities, right? You can pay attention to the way that Fanon's discussion of the veil and bodies under colonialism in Algeria are actually still communicating with what he said about black bodies in his first book. In A Dying Colonialism, the opening iconic chapter of A Dying Colonialism in Algeria Unveiled, Fanon found the French obsession with exposing the veil to be a microcosm of the sadistic and perverse character of the colonial relation. This is how he put it, right? And this is, again, what we continue to go through today. The white sexual violence writ large in negrophobia reemerges vis-a-vis colonized women in Algeria who are shrouded in a romantic exoticism strongly tinged with sexuality. There is a missionary project of erotic conversion. It becomes apparent to Fanon that the colonizer sees the wrenched-aside veil as revealing a hypersexualized body, right? So it's not just a black male body. We keep seeing this develop further. Quote, her timidity and her reserve are transformed in accordance with the commonplace laws of conflictual psychology into their opposite, and the Algerian woman becomes hypocritical, perverse, and even a veritable nymphomaniac in this colonial imagination, close quote. For colonial society, unveiling is equated with breaking her resistance, making her available, and reducing her to an object of possession. The fantasies that Fanon analyzes and the dream materials of French men contain maximal violence. This much is specified not for some abstract woman generically, but for the colonized female here in particular. He writes, there is possession, rape, near murder, almost always in this dream material of the French. Such racist erotic aggression is manifest in persons classified as normal and neuropathological in the West. So everybody characterized as normal, right, by Europeans has these same dreams, right? Once again, a paraneurotic sadism and brutality, he writes, is conveyed by the socio-historical essence of European sexuality after colonialism, in and for colonialism. Or we could say that a dying colonialism is translating for us further that a normal white child, having grown up with a normal white family, will be exposed as abnormal on the slightest contact with the colonized world, right? A dying colonialism seems to remix that line from Black Skin, White Mask. The sexual politics of integration is an issue in all Fanon's work, for this integration is shown to be a racist politics of the most violent colonial paternalism and subjugation. The game of cultural seduction backfires in Algeria Unveiled, however, igniting a sexual revolution for a time inside a revolution of the most militant sort historically. The women of the colonized majority do not activate their own destruction as desired by colonialism. They participate in the armed struggle for national liberation. They replace colonialist unveiling with anti-colonialist unveiling, as well as strategic anti-colonialist reveiling. Instead, making it plain that authentic social transformation can only transpire on these kinds of anti-colonialist terms, not on missionary terms. Their determination is steadfast, despite the legendary ferocity of a colonial regime designed to promote psychological despair. Fanon writes, the leaders of the revolution had no illusions as to the enemies of criminal capacities. Nearly all of them had passed through their jails or had had sessions with survivors from the camps or the cells of the French judicial police. No one of them failed to realize that any Algerian woman arrested would be tortured to death. No, not one of them. The white racist neurosis, constituent of the empire culture of the West, ensures that the torture recounted in Fanon will routinely be a sexual torture. This is in A Dying Colonialism. This is in The Wreckage of the Earth. You can even go back to Black Skin, White Mask, and he's talking about colonial torture in Madagascar, and it all fits this pattern. And it is this context in which he esteems Algerian women's militancy repeatedly as an interior revolt of enormous magnitude. This is the stance of A Dying Colonialism from the Algeria Unveiled to the Algerian family chapters of that book, and it actually segues in several ways to The Wreckage of the Earth, right? So in closing, I want to show you one, more clip.
towards the break from which we would be advised to remove ourselves as quickly as possible. Europe undertook the leadership of the world with ardor, cynicism, and violence. Look at how the shadow of its palaces stretches and multiplies. We must shake off the heavy darkness in which we were cast and leave it behind. Yet it is very true that we need a model, and that we want blueprints and examples. For many among us, the European model was the most inspiring. But when we search for humanity in the technique and style of Europe, we see only a succession of negations of humanity and an avalanche of murders. The human condition, plans for mankind, and collaboration between people in those tasks which increase the sum total of humanity are new problems which demand true inventions. Let us decide not to imitate Europe. Let us combine our muscles and our brains in a new direction. Let us try to create the whole human being, whom Europe has been incapable of bringing to triumphant birth. Two centuries ago, a former European colony decided to catch up with Europe. It succeeded so well that the United States of America became a monster, in which the taints, the sickness, and the inhumanity of Europe have grown to appalling dimensions. The West saw itself as a spiritual adventure. It is the name of the Spirit, in the name of the Spirit of Europe, that the West has made her encroachments, and she has justified her crimes and legitimized the slavery in which she holds 4/5 of humanity. Yes, the European spirit has strange roots. So, comrades, let us not pay tribute to Europe by creating states, institutions, and societies which draw their inspiration from her. Humanity is waiting for something other from us. If we want to turn Africa into a new Europe, then let us leave the destiny of our countries to Europeans. They will know how to do it better than the most gifted among us. But if we want humanity to advance a step further, if we want to bring it up to a different level than that which Europe has shown, then we must invent and we must make discoveries. For Europe, for ourselves, and for humanity. Comrades, we must turn over a new leaf. We must work out new concepts and try to set afoot a new human being.
Okay. All right. So, this is Lauryn Hill. I hope you recognize the voice. The theatrical presence of Lauryn Hill in Goran Olson and Company's recent Concerning Violence documentary is quite the phenomenon. Vocally, her reading of Fanon's text, which began like most of his books as an oral dictation or an incantation, no less verbal, this reading of hers is more than a reading, to be sure. You could say that her words, that their words and voices occupy the screen and possess it like revolutionary spirit mediums. She is an actress as well as a supernova hip-hop MC, and this performance was her first public apparition after her imprisonment by the US government, which is a fact to be unpacked. The Scandinavians may not understand the significance of this, and that must be why they sought out Professor Gayatri Chakravorty-Spivak, right, to be an academic celebrity preface for the film, with a consequent post-colonialist frame. This produces a massive textual contradiction. The bit does not belong and looks like pure advertising, opportunistic for them as well as her. Post-colonial discourse has never had much to say about black people anywhere, let alone black people in North America, while the academic elites of post-colonial studies would remain silent on US colonialism and neo-colonialism, as if the US settler colony and slave state were just academic office space for them to theorize, and not what Fanon dubbed the nation of lynchers, and here a monster colony of the present day. The standard material of post-coloniality has been the 19th century and India, which would eclipse what Sylvia Wynter calls the first wave, before that second wave of Western imperialism. The first wave led by the Hispano-Portuguese slave trade in the 15th and 16th centuries, before the worldwide dominance of the British and French empires several centuries later. Spivak has had virtually zero to say about Fanon for most of her career, yet she is tacked on here as an elite expert. It's not clear that she's watched the whole film, let alone read much of Fanon. She makes a closing comment about gender that ignores a dying colonialism as if it never existed and as if it boasts no connection to concerning violence or the wretched of the earth. For Fanon, it's still, and again, symbolic of black skin, white mask on a certain limited reading, of course. For her commentary here too. Neither the Fanon of black revolutionary movement praxis nor the Fanon of black radical academic scholarship even needs to be consulted for this commercial expertise. T. Denis and Sharpley Whiting made a profound critique of this brand of feminist gender discourse 2 full decades ago in Frantz Fanon, Conflicts and Feminisms, where she charted multiple hypocrisies of feminisms with white colonial fathers that are hostile to Fanonism, and then she reasserts a dying colonialism, especially with radical black women's discourses of Fanonism, such as Toni K. Bombara, Bell Hooks, Frances Beale, to whom we must add Jane Cortez, Sonia Sanchez, and Ntozake Shange. But these aren't the people of post-coloniality. A virtually anonymous postscript is attached to the book now that accompanies the film concerning violence. And it actually moves to correct Spivak's inability to read or even categorize the film, and what I would identify her inability to hear Lauryn Hill's voice or recognize Sharpley Whiting's scholarship or political historical references, thanks to her received category of woman or women in particular. Dr. Gorling here doesn't get an introductory page for his postscript or full name. When you look at the book, like early on, there's a blank black page that says, preface, Professor Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, right? And then at the end, there's like a black page that just says, postscript, and there's no name on it. And then you have to read a small, like italics lettering, on the next page, and it just refers to this guy as like Dr. Gorling, and we don't know what his first name is either, right? Because he's not a celebrity of post-coloniality. But nevertheless, he's insightful. His commentary begins and ends with Lauryn Hill, or what he calls her intriguing intensity that is somewhere between all established forms, neither priest nor philosopher, neither teacher nor journalist, but a bit of all, close quote. Yet hers is definitely not the voice of an academic talking head authority who somehow proclaims in Spivak that the lesson of Fanon is, like Kant, and to remain tied to the tools of the West, even though he is saying a new humanity, Pont Neuf, and a new everything. So in the preface, she actually says that, we could imitate Fanon and make use of all the Western tools like given to us. Like this is the lesson of Fanon, right? This is illiteracy. But the female hip-hop MC would launch her own cinematic mini-concert tour to promote this Fanonian project of hers too. And so there's like the Lauryn Hill project here as well as the filmmakers project here, which are not quite the same thing. Her hip-hop incantation of Les Dames de la Terre will stand with the Mau Mau Group's Black is Black satirical statement on non-readers of Fanon. You can see their music video where the guy says, "Man, you lucky I ain't read Wretched yet," while he's holding the book, as well as Diaz and Donkey Shoot's restaging of the Battle of Algiers as a rap song and music video composed of images solely from Pontecorvo's Fanon-inspired 1966 film, but recently now in 2016. Hip-hop revolution thus adds itself to the Black Power movement of the 60s and 70s and Fanon's own African revolution and the historical genealogy of Fanonism, one that predates and postdates or exceeds any post-colonialist framework. And they reanimate Fanon's own scrupulous attention to black diasporic music and the brazen notes of music emanating from his own radio, tuned to the voice of fighting Algeria. So in conclusion, the myth of post-coloniality is grounded in a territorial ruse or deception, whether it's explicit or implicit. The academic study of colonialism traditionally reinforces the conceptual reduction of colonialism to a simple matter of land or the official political administrative colonization of lands. Whereas Fanon is consistently poetic in his rejection of such a narrow misconception of past, present, and future colonialisms. Indeed, colonialism for Fanon is an atmospheric matter of flesh and personhood and psyche, as well as culture and politics and economics, etc. It is never strictly about territory alone. and his territory is never their territory, properly speaking. For even his vital invocations of land bestow this land with extraterritorial associations. It is the land that will bring the people in their sacred hands their proverbial land, their proverbial bread, and above all, dignity. A statement which would supply a legendary slogan to third cinema and third world movements everywhere. The territory to be occupied by colonialism is manifold, beyond geographical territories of the map. The colonizer inflicts wounds on the land, as well as on the body and consciousness of colonized persons, of colonized peoples, right? Fanon touches and talks to this land and listens. The land of the land-bred dignity slogan lives politically in Fanon, as it does metaphysically in so many indigenous cosmologies. It is not the land of the bourgeois nation-state system of the Western world empire, which is dead and mute and merely exploitable land on which to plant a flag. The flag which is the flag of flag independence at best for Africa and the non-West of the rest of the world. Conceptually, Fanon's land lives in the atmosphere of life with other living entities fighting for a life that is not a living death under colonialism. It is where life awaits in liberation, Fanon's atmosphere. This is how les damnés, or the wretched, are the damned and the wretched of the earth, after all. And why Fanon will champion the maximum independence of human persons, along with the true and total independence of national populations at the level of geopolitical international states. The human nervous system at the heart of the world's social system is central to Fanon's sociogeny of revolution in all texts and at all times. Hence, Sarah Maldoror would dub him a real homme de la terre. His elemental anti-colonialist references to one's physical person and to national peoples besides land, as well as to our atmosphere as a more comprehensive arena where colonialism and anti-colonialism do battle, amount to a marvelous critical vocabulary that remains hidden by post-colonialist, if not certain other discourses. Fanon rejected the territorial ruse or deception and a dying colonialism when he wrote, "It is not the soil that is occupied, it is not the ports or the airdromes. French colonialism has settled itself into the very center of the Algerian individual and has undertaken a sustained work of cleanup, of expulsion, of self, of rationally pursued mutilation." So you see in Fanon where colonialism expands itself everywhere and is not just a question of quote unquote land. The colonial occupation exceeds the soil. It's in the water and the air and ourselves until we expunge it. Fanon rejected the territorial ruse into the African Revolution or the FLN communiques of al-Mujahid when he wrote, quote, "True liberation is not that pseudo-independence in which ministers having a limited responsibility hobnob with an economy dominated by the colonial pact. Liberation is the total destruction of the colonial system, from the preeminence of the language of the oppressor and departmentalization to the customs union that in reality maintains the colonized in the meshes of the culture, of the fashion, and of the images of the colonialist." This is a radical decolonization which absolutely none of us know today, all right? And Fanon rejected the territorial ruse in the Resistance Algérienne, appendix to Algeria Unveiled and a Dying Colonialism, when he also wrote, "There is not occupation of territory on the one hand and independence of persons on the other. It is the country as a whole, its history, its daily posations that are contested, disfigured, in the hope of a final destruction. Under these conditions, the individual's breathing is an observed and occupied breathing. It is a combat breathing. The atmosphere, therefore, is the air we breathe to survive. Colonialism is no less an occupation of this air and this breath. Anti-colonialism is the struggle then, as now, for air and breath and land and more, beyond the colonialist conception of both territory and colonialism itself. This sustained concern for the breath and atmosphere even begins back in Black Skin, White Mask before its revolutionization by the complete Fanon, the bulk of Fanon, the African revolutionary Fanon. Evidently, Fanon's anti-colonialist writing and praxis is a praxis of combat fighting for a new society, a new humanity, and a new atmosphere as well. No wonder the cinéaste Maldoror would hope to complete her final film on Fanon entitled Un souffle dans le vent, right? Or Breath in the Wind. Thank you for sitting here in the heat for so long. Thank you.